In this video, we're going to cover the very basics of JavaScript. So we have here a web page that has some HTML and some JavaScript behind it. So the very first thing we're going to do is talk about comments. And what we can do is we can comment out all of these final lessons, and we can do this with Control/, and if we hit Control S and now commented out the JavaScript for lessons 2 and 3. But you can actually also comment out HTML. So let's actually comment out the HTML for lessons 2 and 3. Again, select by holding down the Shift key, down arrow, and then Control/, save, and now we just have our very first lesson comments. Now I'm using a website called codesandbox.io, and I will leave a link to this lesson in the description of this video. And so you can play around with this web page and go through what I'm going to go through with you today. So this little tutorial presumes that you know a little bit about HTML and maybe a little CSS, but let's not worry too much about that. But it presumes that you're pretty new to JavaScript and you need to go through the very fundamentals. So the first thing we're going to talk about is single line comments. So you start a single line comment with a double /, and then all the text on that same line after those double /s becomes a comment. If I removed these double /s, then my code editor would start to complain, because it would start to think that this is actual code that it needs to try and run. But we don't want this to be code that we want to try and run. We want this to be an actual comment. And a comment is simply some text that you don't want to run, and it might be a way for you to annotate what your code is actually doing, or it could just be telling another developer who wrote that code, so you could put your name in, anything you want really. Now you can do comments that go over multiple lines, either by doing multiple lines like this, so you could do this as well. But a better way of doing this is to do a ***, and then your comments, and then you have to end with an ***. If you don't end it, then that's actually an error. So that's about it for comments. Let's move on to lesson 2. If we come back to our index.html and we uncomment the HTML for lesson 2, and here we're going to talk about the 8 data types of JavaScript. So the first data type of JavaScript is undefined. And this is an example of an undefined variable. So I've declared a variable with either let or var. So I could actually use var in here, and that's also a completely valid way of declaring a variable, but I will carry on using let. And if you haven't come across variables before, a good explanation of a variable is that variables are containers for storing data. So just like you might have containers in your kitchen, you might have one that says coffee on the side of it, and you just want to store coffee in that container. Variables are also containers, but this one here, I've just declared it, but I haven't put anything in it. And so it is undefined. So we have a keyword here called undefined, and I'm using a triple equals here. Triple equals basically tests for equality and for the same type. And so if anything is equal to undefined and is the same type as undefined, then this line here is like a simple one line if then else statement. So you may have come across if then else statements, and it's similar to saying if this, then return this, otherwise return that. And so because this is true, we are going to return undefined. And so I'm adding to this list here. Don't worry too much about this add to, this is for a later lesson. But I'm adding to this list here undefined, and that's what this line of code does. Okay, let's move on to the next data type. So I'm selecting these two lines, and then I'm doing Control / to uncomment, and then I'm saving with Control S. And now we have another line, null, which is our second data type. So now I'm assigning anything to null. Now null is an interesting one, and the best explanation I found for it is null is the intentional absence of any object value. So you are intentionally saying that this variable has the value null. And so again, I'm comparing anything to null and using this triple equals, which again compares both value and data type. So anything has to have both the value and the data type of null, which it does. This equates to true, and so we return the first one here, null. Okay, let's move on to our third data type. So now you see we have a line here, true. So we have assigned anything to true. Now true isn't the data type, but Boolean is the data type. So showing true here is actually wrong. So what should we do? So we can actually go in here and we can replace this with Boolean, and now we see the proper name of the data type, Boolean. But true is of type Boolean. And we have another that is a Boolean, which is false. But this now says something else, which is incorrect. We also want to say Boolean here. So a way we can fix this is we can delete this and we can say type of anything. And now it's correctly saying Boolean, because it is this type of returns the type of this variable. And so if I change this to true, we also get Boolean. So that Boolean is our third data type. Okay, we've moved on to our fourth data type, and that is string. So from now on, we're going to use this type of. And so the type of player name, as you can see, is string. So we can type in anything here between these two double quotes and it would be a string still. We can also use single quotes. Although CodeSandbox.io seems to like to convert them back to double quotes, but single quotes are also valid. But you should stick to one type to be consistent. So I'm going to use double quotes throughout this lesson. The next data type is number. So as you can imagine, strings are good for things like player names, town names, city names, etc. So if you want to hold that kind of data, then that's ideal for a string. Number variables hold numbers, and so they're good for things like player scores. If you're writing an accountancy package, that's how you would be storing people's bank account values with numbers. And of course we can put pretty large numbers in here. The sixth data type is an object. An object has a property and a value. So a good example of an object is if you wanted to hold all the stats for a player in one place, you could use an object. And you can even have strings in here. So I could keep the name of the player in here as well, and that's perfectly valid. The seventh data type is symbol. Now symbols have quite a specialized use case, which I won't go into at this moment, but definitely good to know that they exist as a data type. And the eighth data type is big int. Again, quite a specialized data type, and unless you're doing some very specialized work, you probably not need to use such big integers, but good to know that it exists if you do need to do that. You denote a big int by putting an n on the end of the number. Okay, that's a brief introduction to the 8 data types of JavaScript. Now let's move on to some basic math. So if we come back to our index.html and we uncomment that and save. And now we're doing our math lesson. So we should breeze through these pretty quickly because I'm going to presume you know your math, but it's good to know how you do this type of math in JavaScript. So as you can see, we've got a line here that says 6 plus 12 equals 18. So the 18 here is this total here. And what we've done is we have concatenated this string here with total. And so this doesn't mathematically add them up. This is actually, if you have a string, then it's going to presume that you are using this plus as a concatenation to add this as a string and this as a string. And so it returns the whole thing as a string. And this is what we're seeing down here. This whole line here is a string. But if you use the plus operator for numbers, this is how you do math. So we are doing 6 plus 12 equals 18, and that total is coming here. We of course can do subtraction. So 7 minus 13 is minus 6. We're doing 3 times 4. So this symbol here is actually used for multiplication in most programming languages, not just JavaScript. Three divided by 4, again, in most languages this is a divide by character. Now this is perhaps something you haven't seen before, and this is 2 pluses, one after the other, and that actually means increment. So this is the equivalent of total equals total plus 1. Get exactly the same line here. It's just a shorthand. Much quicker to type that. So it takes the 10 and it increments it. It adds 1 to it. And so 10 incremented equals 11. We have the equivalent double minus, which is decrement minus 1. 8 decremented equals 7. We can specify decimal numbers or floating point numbers by putting in a decimal point. So 11.6 is either a decimal or a floating point number. So now we're moving on to remainders. So 5, and then this is the remainder operator, 2, and that will return the remainder of that division. So that will actually return 1. It's similar to the modulo operator in other languages, although apparently there are some subtle differences, but I won't cover those here. But just consider it to be its own operator called the remainder operator. This is another example. So we've divided 8 by 5 and the remainder of that would be 3. So this operation here returns 3. And then we have an operator that is a little bit of a shorthand. So this plus equals is the equivalent of doing compound equals compound plus 2. plus equals means you don't have to type all this, just have to type that. And there's the equivalent for minus, and there's also the equivalent for multiply and divide, but I'm not going to show those here. And that's it for this tutorial on the very basics of JavaScript. If you've enjoyed the tutorial, please consider subscribing to the channel. Thank you very much.